I mean, we started with Griffith, and we ended up with, I don't know what the hell's going on now, but basically,
well, this
nothing.
thing will set them straight.
Yeah.
So now that we've seen all the problems that come up when we try to define where film begins, let's see what other problems come up when we try to define or put a mark on when the cinematic language itself is established. In order to do this, we will do what most historians do, and we will try to explore this very important figure in film history, a man called D.W. Griffith, as he is the first, or one of the first, to discover the expressive potential of moving images. So I know it was a while ago, but in the last lesson we tried to establish when film was invented, but we never really approached it as an art form on itself. So we try to discuss like its invention and the technical aspects, but now we need to move past all those considerations and really start thinking about film as an art form. Moving on from now, that's what we really want to be talking about from a historic perspective, right? Obviously all those considerations were very important, but now we've reached a defining point, and it really is where film finds its bearings, its expressive potential and language. Now film really becomes an art form. So I don't want to go over all of this over and over again, but defining things like this is very problematic. So all I'm going to do is give you a few pointers and try to explore what was happening at that time. Just to go back a little before we get into that, I would like to make clear that up until now, we saw film as an attraction, like as a circus object, as a curiosity, as an invention that would be shown around, mostly for its innovation aspect, and not really for what it could say, but only for what it could show. What is interesting is that now we are really at a point where film finds its own identity and drifts away from a mode of representation that it had borrowed for way too long, and that is theater. If you've noticed in the last video, what we talked about was really about how the cinematographers would put a camera and film a scene in only one point of view, right? Or even Méliès, like, he would really just put the camera and film the action as seen from the perspective of a theater spectator, right? As if he was looking at a play. Those filmmakers, before the filmmakers that we're going to talk about today, they didn't go as far as to wonder, hey, if I move the camera around, if I use different angles, could I say something in a different manner? So what's interesting about this time, this specific period that we're going to talk about today, is not only the filmmakers, but also that some people, some intellectuals, start writing theory about film. And that's what's interesting, is that film is now established, really established as an art form. So for instance, Vachel Lindsay writes in The Art of the Moving Image, cinema is now part of the fine arts. It is no longer filmed theater. And there's another Italian film theorist called Ricciardo Canuto. He writes in 1911, cinema is a superb conciliation of the rhythms of space, the plastic arts, and the rhythms of time, music and poetry, a synthesis of the 5 ancient arts, architecture, sculpture, painting, music, and poetry. So he calls cinema the 6th art form. And I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but we usually say that cinema is the 7th art form. So I think Ricciardo Canuto was under the influence of some type of substance of something, but he later corrects himself and includes dance as the 6th precursor, making cinema the 7th art as we know it today. So he goes further and he says the cinematograph is an art and film is a work of art. So that's very important and very interesting, I think, because what we're going to talk about now is really based on those, in that frame of thought. We're no longer talking or wondering, hey, when was film invented? When did this all start? Now we're talking about, when did we start getting expressive with it? When did we find all its power and all its potential? And of course there's Griffith, right? There is Griffith, and all historians would agree that there's Griffith. But before Griffith, there's Edwin S. Porter, who you may know because of The Great Train Robbery, which is a very well-known movie. I think Scorsese, he references it in some of his movies. And also in the intro to these videos, the last shot where there's a bandit that shoots at the camera, well, that's a shot, a very very iconic shot from the Great Train Robbery. So maybe we could try and see a little excerpt from that movie right now. As you can see, in this movie and in The Life of an American Fireman, we can already see some type of an early development of the language of film. It's no longer a single point of view, it's no longer like a film theater, it's something more. In the first movie, for example, we can see the first close-up shot of the history of film, which is remarkable, because this filmmaker, Porter, he already understood that if you get closer to the subject, there's something that happens there. There's something there. The attention of the spectator is drawn towards that object because he has no choice. There's nothing else in the frame, so he has no choice but to pay attention to that detail. There are other close-up shots in that movie too, but there's also, what is interesting is that there's also an early form of filmic rhythm and a use of space that differs from the representational mode that we had seen so far. In the second movie, in the Great Train Robbery, and it's funny because it's actually based on a successful play, the viewers actually get to see for the first time, or one of the first times, an actual story from beginning to end. With all this, we can argue that there's a narrative form being born. Another thing that's interesting to note about the Great Train Robbery is that the viewers also get to see two different actions alternating. What this means is that there's two actions that happen at the same time. The viewer knows that these two actions that they're showing me happen at different places, but they're happening simultaneously. This is called parallel editing, and this is a very, very, very important innovation that will become very common as cinematic language evolves, and we still see this in movies today. So, in other words, with Porter, we can already see that there's a huge change in the use of the camera and the way the filmmakers started thinking about how to use their images, because there wasn't sound there yet. Well, actually, we could argue that there was sound because people would play music, so that would be the sound and the rhythm of the movie, and music could be used to convey emotions and things like that, but there wasn't a synchronous sound coming from the movie itself. Now that we know what Porter brought to the table, it's time to wonder why can't we say that he started the cinematic form? How come we're not talking about him when we think about the cinematic language? One of the reasons is that when we tell the history of an art form, we make choices, right? I talked a lot about this in the first lesson, but it's still interesting to think about because you can see that there's a lot of things here that still remain in filmmaking today. But there's a more important reason, and that is that Porter uses a very archaic form of these techniques. And he didn't do it in a masterful way. There's a naive use of this, and he's still trying, you know? It's like a baby that's just crawling, you know? He's not walking yet. But in any case, what we can say and be certain about is that he is at the beginning of a discovery. Now let's move on to how the language that Porter started becomes institutionalized. It affirms itself and becomes the de facto way that movies can be told. So this happens with D.W. Griffith, who is a very, very interesting figure in the history of film, and I would even argue that he's a very interesting figure in history itself. So a little bit about the man himself first. He initially dreamt of becoming a great American playwright, so he didn't encounter a lot of success as a playwright. He turned into an actor and worked with Porter, who we just talked about. And very quickly he became passionate about directing. He makes his first movie, The Adventures of Dolly, and very quickly then he makes a first feature. And his first feature is the first to be shot in Hollywood. It's called Judith of Bethulia in 1914. He worked at Biograph for a while, a very important company at that time, and he shot over 450 movies there. But when Biograph started having some problems and started questioning if the viewers would be that interested in long form movies and things like that, he eventually leaves the company and ends up producing his masterpiece. Nowadays we know it as The Birth of a Nation, but back then, when it was first released, it was known as The Klansman. If you know anything about KKK, you know what this movie was about, right? So the subject matter on itself is problematic. It does say a lot about the figure, about D.W. Griffith. From some testimonials that I've read about him, he was maybe a little bit hard to work with. For instance, Lydian Gish says, "With Mr. Griffith, we would not ask questions. We would only answer his." So I think that gives you a good impression of the type of guy he may have been. So yeah, let's just go back to the history of it and not concentrate too much on the character, because he was a filmmaking genius, really, no matter what type of person he was. So to come back to it, the influence of Birth of a Nation really is undeniable, and most historians would agree that this film really marks a specific moment where the art of silent film was born. For instance, he uses multiple techniques in a masterful manner. He knows what he's doing. It's not like with Porter, where you can feel that he's trying things. His ability as a filmmaker can also be noted in movies such as Intolerance, which is a sort of response to the criticisms that he received because of Birth of a Nation. And what's funny is that Intolerance is also historically important because it's the first big commercial failure for a feature film. And another one of his movies, Broken Blossoms, is also interesting. And those three movies, I think, really show the skills of Griffith. So let's see these techniques in detail. So regarding the editing, right, in his movies, both in Birth of a Nation and mostly in Intolerance, we can see how he developed the parallel editing that we talked about with Porter even further. He, for instance, in Intolerance, he's telling multiple stories at the same time, even when they're not happening in the same time period. Griffith uses intertitles. He would use textual mentions in between shots to clarify or to make explicit certain plot points. Then when it comes to shooting the movie itself and with the editing, he would make use of the reverse shot pattern, which consists of, it's pretty simple. It's you have shot A and then there's shot B, which shows the opposite direction of the first shot that you saw. Then he would make use of eyeline match, which is really important to give a good sense of space and of direction to the viewer. So this is shot A presents someone looking at something off screen, and shot B shows us what is being looked at. Then there's match on movement. We keep the direction of movement persistent from the first shot to the second, which means that, say, if a character leaves the screen to the right in shot A, he will enter the screen from the left in shot B, because if he entered the next shot from the right side, we would think, hey, he's coming back, right? It would give us that impression. Then there's match on action, which consists of showing the first shot, the beginning of an action, and cutting to the end of that same action in the second shot. Besides editing, when it comes to framing, Griffith displayed a very good understanding of different camera angles and the expressive of framing particular details or subjects in a specific way to tell a story. So now we really aren't anymore in a single point of view, but multiple. All of this to create a solid narrative, a story that holds up from beginning to end, and that can only exist and be told in this specific manner thanks to film. Even further, he understood camera movement and what a traveling is. He managed to build suspense. So all of this really culminates in Griffith building some sort of vocabulary for film. Some sort of different ways of framing, shooting, editing a movie so we can build different feelings on the viewer, different rhythms, to tell the story in a very specific way that could not be told in any other art form. So here, between this lesson and the past lesson, we really have to find how do we get to having cinema, right? So cinema really starts here. It really gets to a point here where it's an art form that's becoming to get accepted by academics, by filmmakers, by viewers. Not everyone, but we're not thinking about film anymore as a curiosity. We're not thinking about film anymore as an invention. It truly is an art form now. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any comments or you would like to start a discussion about Griffith's movies or his techniques or anything like that, you can comment either on the subreddit or on the video. And yeah, thanks for watching.